Okay, welcome back to part 2 of Chapter 6, the police organization role and function. So we left off talking about rapid response. Now we're going to jump into kind of the last part of the patrol function before we get into a couple of technology things. So we're going to talk now about procedural justice. So patrol can be made more effective when police pay attention to how they treat citizens. For example, researchers have found that when officers treat citizens with dignity and respect, the citizens are more likely to be satisfied with the experience and to accept that particular decision. And research also indicates that precinct level efforts to ensure that officers are respectful of citizens can also help lower the number of complaints and improve community relations. So in other words, the police must pay attention to what they call procedural justice. Now, procedural justice is the idea of being treated fairly during a process or a procedure. Let's say a traffic stop, and maybe you ran a red light or were speeding, or you just got stopped for something else. All right. Concern with making decisions that are arrived at through through procedures that are viewed as fair. And if people view the procedures as unfair, then they'll be, less likely to support police in crime fighting efforts. So, part of procedural justice is fairness, voice, transparency, and impartiality. So again, procedural justice, there's a concern with making decisions that are arrived at through procedures that are viewed as fair. Okay. And I think that, it's a really good process to kind of consider. Fundamentally, again, procedural justice concerns the fairness and the transparency of the process by which decisions are made, and may be contrasted with distributive justice, where fairness in the distribution of rights or resources, and even retributive justice, where the fairness and punishment of wrongs. So basically, hearing all parties before a decision is made is one step which would be considered appropriate to be taken in order that a process be characterized as procedurally fair. So I have a link here to the California Commission on Peace Officers Standards and Training. They call it POST. And here's a link to a video that POST put out that really highlights procedural justice. So take a moment when you can and watch that video. I think you'll find it very enlightening, and it will bring a lot more context to this whole procedural justice thing. Okay? So with that being said, now we're going to kind of look at some technology. And these are things that can improve the patrol function. So, police departments have also relied on technology to help guide their patrol efforts. And one of the best known programs, CompStat, basically, kind of began in New York City as a means of directing police efforts in a more kind of productive fashion, if you will. And William Bratton, the commissioner of New York PD at that time, wanted to revitalize the department and break through its antiquated kind of bureaucratic structure. So he installed a computerized system that gave local precinct commanders up-to-date information about where and when crime was occurring within their jurisdiction, within their area, okay? Which is actually pretty cool. And part of this CompStat program, twice weekly crime control strategy meetings basically brought precinct commanders together with the department's top administrators who asked them to report out on the crime problems in their areas and to tell what they were doing to turn things around. And this was kind of the first of its kind, if you will. But so CompStat is basically a method of management accountability and a philosophy of crime control. And it really did and still does in some areas work very, very well. But there are 4 basic principles to CompStat. First would be accurate and timely intelligence, so making sure that you're getting all of that data, right? All of that information. Effective tactics. Rapid deployment, meaning that once you get the data and you figure out what you want to do it, quickly. Don't just sit around and wait. And then pretty much relentless follow-up and assessment, meaning following up to see how things are working and assessing whether or not you're actually making a dent in crime, etc. So kind of a really cool thing, but this is called CompStat. And here's a couple of photos that actually depict CompStat meetings. And it could be a stressful process because you would have to get up in front of these top administrators and tell them what was happening in your areas and also what you were doing to fix it. So very, very challenging, but also very, very stressful. And then, of course, we have, the implementation of body cameras. And on page 212 and 213 in your textbook, it talks about criminal justice technology and body cameras. So there's a lot of good information that's out there on body cameras. And if you don't know, and actually if you look on page 13, the second paragraph, it starts like this. In the first study of body-worn cameras in the United States, Tony Farrar, that's me, Chief Tony Farrar for the Rialto Police Department. We were the first agency to actually do a randomized control trial study in conjunction with the University of Cambridge in England to take a look at whether or not body cameras would be effective. And basically, we found that use of force and complaints just plummeted. So it was actually a very interesting, cool study. And I'll put in a link to where you can read a little bit more about it. But body cameras would be another thing. And they're very, very, of course, they're in many agencies right now across the United States. Also, on page 214, it talks about drones and the fact that police departments across the country have purchased small unmanned surveillance drones, not unlike the drones used to track terrorists in Iraq and Afghanistan for the purposes of, tracking drug dealers and other persons of interest. So there's a lot of, support and also some controversy as it relates to drones. But consider their use, just kind of think about the use of drones and what might they be good for when it comes to technology in policing. So again, as we kind of finish up the patrol function side, you can see here we've got the strategy on the left, the different types of strategy, the tactic that's going to be used, and then the goal. So kind of a little chart to help you better discern between the different concepts. Now quickly we're going to talk about the investigative function. So since the first independent detective bureau was established by the London Met Police in 1841, criminal investigators have been kind of romantic figures vividly portrayed in novels, movies, and TV shows. And the fictional police detectives are, they're usually depicted as loners who are willing to break department rules, perhaps even violate the law in order to achieve their goal, which is, catching the suspect. And again, the average fictional detective views department policies and the U.S. Supreme Court decisions as unfortunate roadblocks to police efficiency. Civil rights are either ignored or basically kind of, scorned, if you will. Now, although every police department probably has a few aggressive detectives who, might take matters into their own hands at the expense of a person's rights, modern criminal investigators are likely to be extremely experienced civil servants trained in investigative techniques, knowledgeable about legal rules of evidence and procedure, and at least somewhat cautious about the legal and administrative consequences of their actions. So, really important. And usually detectives have been on the department for quite some time, and they know the rules, they know the laws, and they follow them. So again, investigative work is less visible than patrol work, right? Because it's kind of, after the fact, if you will. And to the general public, the term criminal investigator often brings to mind these detectives that we see on TV, or, in a book or in magazines or at the movies, etc. So detectives, they do work closely with patrol officers to provide an immediate investigative response to crimes or incidents, something that the patrol officers can't handle. Okay, so it might be a child abuse case where they need an expert interviewer to talk to a young child. It might be a serious sex crime. It could be a homicide. These are things that detectives will be called out to assist patrol and actually take over parts of that investigation. Many police departments, they have separate units or squads or even divisions, depending upon the size, if you were LAPD, of detectives who investigate crimes, again, ranging from vice, which would be, gambling, prostitution, pornography, etc., all the way to gangs, to, corporate crime, thefts, assaults, kitty crimes, and homicides. So again, and a lot of these detective units, the larger units, have specialized folks that work in these units. So you might have several detectives assigned to crimes against persons. You may have a group of individuals that do computer crimes. You might have a group that are on call for homicides. So a lot of times there are specialty officers within that detective group. And the detective or investigator basically kind of digs out the evidence, finds it, collects, information from people, from informants and witnesses, etc., in the attempt to identify criminals and find enough information to track them down, and then, of course, hopefully bring them to justice. So typically how it works, again, is the officer might respond to the robbery at the liquor store, and typically the suspect may not be there. They've already fled the scene, so the officer might, will get there, secure the scene, and a detective will come out and pick up that investigation. So that's how homicides work, that's how, kidnappings work, etc. All right, so different units that are kind of within, they're still in the investigative function. You have vice units that, again, they investigate gambling, bookmaking, prostitution, pornography. You have narcotics units that investigate narcotic sales, transportation, things like that. You have gang units that investigate all the different types of gang crimes. So you have these very specialized units. Even within larger traffic units, you might have a traffic investigative squad. They call them the Major Accident Investigation Team. They're called MATE. And basically they are super trained in engineering, math, and different things like that. And they come out and they recreate and investigate fatal accidents. So that would be, there are investigators even in traffic units. So how then do detectives detect? So, we talked about that detectives investigate the cause of crime and attempt to identify the individuals responsible. They may enter a case after patrol officers have made the initial contact, such as when a patrol car, interrupts a crime in progress and the offender flees before they can be caught. Detectives can investigate a case entirely on their own, sometimes by following up on leads provided by informants. Sometimes detectives go undercover in order to investigate crime, right? A lone undercover officer can infiltrate a criminal group or organization to gather information on future criminal activity, like going undercover in a biker gang or a street gang, etc. Undercover officers can also pose as victims to capture predatory criminals who have been conducting street robbery, so pretending to maybe be homeless and possibly becoming a victim of a robbery so they can arrest the perpetrator. So in a study of investigative techniques, Martin Inns found that police detectives rely heavily on interviews and forensic evidence to reconstruct the crime, creating, in a sense, the story, if you will, that sets out how, where, and why. And to create this story, contemporary detectives typically use kind of a three-prong approach, if you will. So the first would be a specific focus. Detectives interview witnesses, gather evidence, record events, and collect facts that are available, at the crime scene, at the immediate crime scene. Then they have general coverage, which is canvass the neighborhood and make observations, conduct interviews with friends, family, associates, contact others for information regarding victims, suspects, construct victim or suspect timelines to outline their whereabouts before the incident, etc. And then finally, they have the kind of the informative or the information data gathering. And here detectives use different types of modern technology to collect records of cell phones and, your textbook says pagers, but they don't really use pagers anymore. But sure, pagers, computer hard drives, tablets, laptops, notebooks, desktops, servers, diaries, notes, documents. Information includes the data used by persons of interest in the investigation that tell about their lives, interaction with others, and even geographical connections. So a lot of things that they do, even social media, by getting on somebody's Facebook. So all of these things are part of that investigative process, if you will. Along with that, when you're talking about undercover, would be sting operations. So another approach to detective work, commonly referred to as a sting operation, involves organized groups of detectives who basically deceive criminals into openly committing illegal acts or conspiring to engage in criminal activity. So it could be an undercover female police officer standing on the street soliciting people to stop, or standing out there hoping that somebody stops and solicits them for sex. So basically she's pretending to be a prostitute and they end up arresting the John. Okay, so that's part of a sting operation. Or it could be something a lot longer, maybe a long undercover thing that leads to a drug bust. But, sting operations also have drawbacks. By its very nature, a sting involves a little bit of deceit by police officers that can come sometimes very close to entrapment. So we do have to kind of consider that as you do these different undercover type operations. Because sting operations, just to kind of finish, may encourage criminals to commit new crimes because they have a new source, let's say, for maybe fencing stolen property. And innocent people may be hurt, may hurt their reputation by buying merchandise from a sting operation when they had no idea that the item was actually stolen. So the government, law enforcement, just needs to be careful not to cross that line into entrapment when they do these covert police activities. Okay. Then there's the basic undercover work, because sometimes detectives go undercover to investigate crime, right? And undercover work can take several different forms. It could be where you pose as criminals or even as victims. It is considered a necessary element of police work, although it can be dangerous, right? If you're going to go undercover as a drug seller or buyer, if you will, and you're going to have to meet someone and purchase a large amount of drugs, that could be extremely dangerous. All right. And at the end of the day, depending upon the type and length of the assignment, it could pose psychological problems for the officer. What if in your undercover capacity, you have to get involved in some criminal activity or witness something? Or let's say being away from home, keeping late hours, always worrying that your identity is going to be uncovered, and you could be killed. Officers have experienced, kind of what they call post-undercover strain resulting from trouble at work, and in many instances kind of messes up their marriage or even messes up the case. And really, hanging around with criminals for a long time, you could actually make friends with them, and earning their trust can also have a damaging kind of effect. So there's all these issues, and typically that's why departments limit the amount of time for an undercover assignment. So for narcotics, it's usually 2 years plus 1, so 3 years at the max. So that way you're not hanging out with all the narcotic suspects for so long that you start to get apathetic or something like that. Does that kind of make sense? Same with gang officers, etc. So that you have to rotate, out of the assignment after a certain amount of time. So how then do we evaluate these investigations? Well, serious criticism has been leveled at the nation's detective forces on getting bogged down in paperwork and being relatively inefficient in clearing cases. And one famous study of 153 detective bureaus found that a great deal of a detective's time was spent in what we call non-productive work, and that investigative expertise did little to solve the case. There's things to kind of consider, right? So, when you talk about evaluating investigations, it creates considerable paperwork and is relatively inefficient in clearing cases. Ways to improve would be patrol officers should have greater responsibilities at the scene, meaning that they should be securing the scene and maybe even locating evidence and doing other things instead of just locking down the scene, waiting for a detective to get there. Specialized units, of course, can bring expertise. So if you have a homicide and it's a gang homicide, you're going to want to call the gang unit to come help the detectives, or they might even be the gang detectives to work that particular incident. And then, of course, collection of physical evidence is really important. So instead of having a detective collect the evidence, maybe you have a forensic technician position or a crime scene tech or whatever you call them, and have those individuals that are trained properly to locate and collect your physical evidence for processing. And then finally, the use of technology. So, of course, using good technology streamlines and enhances that entire investigative process. So an example could be, let's say that you need to put out a composite sketch of a suspect. In my day, when I started in law enforcement, somebody actually they sketched that possible suspect. Then later on in my career, they had these plastic sheets that had like different pieces of parts on it, like eyebrows and noses and eyeballs and mouth and, ears, and you would layer each plastic piece until you would build a composite. Now they actually have a composite on the computer. So it's quite a bit faster. The same with DNA processing, etc. So technology is a really good thing. So with that being said, we do want to talk about, ineffective investigations, right? And, one reason for ineffective investigations is that detectives often lack sufficient resources to carry out that lengthy, ongoing, case. But, we do have to kind of know that not every department has all the money in the world either. So here's some reasons for ineffective investigations. Unsolved cases. Almost 50% of burglary cases are screened out by a supervisor before assignment to a detective for follow-up. 75% are dropped after the first day of follow-up. Okay, so, although robbery cases are more likely to be assigned to detectives, 75% of those are also dropped after one day. 2 could be the length of the investigation. Most cases are investigated no more than 4 hours, stretching over 3 days, an average of 11 days between the initial report of a crime and the suspension of the investigation. Next would be sources of information. Early in the investigation, the focus is on the victim. As the investigation is pursued, that emphasis swings and is switched to the suspect. Okay, and that kind of makes sense. The most critical information for determining case outcome is the name and description of the suspect and related crime information. Okay. Finally, effectiveness. Preliminary investigations by patrol officers are really critical. In situations in which a suspect identity is not known immediately after the crime is committed, detectives make an arrest in less than 10% of the cases. So given these findings, detective work may be improved if there's a greater emphasis on collecting physical evidence at the scene of a crime, identifying witnesses, checking departmental records, and even using informants. The probability of successfully settling a case is improved if patrol officers gather evidence at the scene of a crime and effectively communicate it to detectives working the case. Also recommended then would be the use of targeted investigations that direct attention at a few individuals, like career criminals, those who are known to have engaged in this specific behavior. And there is also evidence that additional resources for detectives, like technological advances, etc., really does kind of make things a little bit better in the long run. Okay, so we're going to talk quickly about community policing, and we have just a couple more things to cover. So I might end up running just a little bit over, but hopefully not too much. So we talk about community policing. I wanted you to see this picture because I was basically, a lieutenant at the time, a lieutenant or a captain, but anyway, I had this young kid come to our police department on a tour, and he handed me this picture. I was in my office, and when you look at it, it says, "Thank you, police department, for protecting our city and cleaning up our streets. When I get old enough, I'll enroll in the Explorer program and become a police officer. Thanks, Josh." And you can see that here it says LAPD, even though I didn't work for LAPD, and it says gang member. So this is this, officer tasing the gang member. And part of the question that I had, I put this up on my bulletin board. I thought it was really cool. But then I started to think about why would a young kid that's like in the 6th grade think, that's the view that they have of police, right? So it just kind of enhances our conversation on community policing and the role models that we should be to younger kids and how the community views law enforcement in general. And if you don't think community policing is a really big thing, again, I put some magazines up here that aren't too old, 2017, 2016, 2012, but you hear, You've got community policing, police community relations, etc. So it's super important. So what is then community policing? Okay, so for generations, police agencies have been trying to gain the cooperation and respect of the communities that they serve. At first, efforts at improving relationships between police departments and the public involved programs that really had kind of the title of police community relations. So we tried to kind of change that a little bit. Now, in response to some of the limitations of earlier approaches to policing, community-oriented policing, this type of program, has been implemented in large cities, suburban areas, and rural communities. And it's also described as simply community policing. And really, it's regarded as one of the most significant trends in the history of policing. Scholars and practitioners suggest that community policing continues to evolve, and as society's needs change, so do the methods it uses to keep the police. And community policing is basically, a program designed to bring police and the public together and create a more cooperative environment between them. So very, very important, okay? And on page 221 in your textbook, it talks about some of the components of community policing. But we're not going to go into every single aspect. So again, it's an organization-wide philosophy and management approach that basically promotes community, government, and police partnerships, proactive problem solving to prevent crime, and community engagement to address the causes of crime, the fear of crime, and some of those community issues. So there really is a lot to kind of consider when you talk about community policing. So it consists of kind of a return to an earlier style of policing where officers were on the beat and had a very kind of personal contact with citizens. And it can be a specific program or a philosophy, but the key components again would be community partnerships, the organizational transmission or transformation, and problem solving. Some of the challenges, though, and there are going to be challenges, right, could be defining your community. So, really kind of, what is your community life like? What's the main focus in your community? Okay. What things do the community folks think need to be done? Next would be defining roles. Figuring out who is going to do what. And are we going to have foot patrols or car patrols or motorcycle patrols, etc.? Changing the supervisor attitudes. Some supervisors are a little wary of community policing because it kind of supports a decentralized command structure, so they don't feel like they're in charge as much. Maybe reorientating police values. Research shows that police officers who have a traditional crime control orientation are less satisfied with community policing efforts than those who are kind of public service oriented. So you may want to relook at your values. Revisit training. So it's going to require that police departments alter their training, especially during new officer field training, right? So they understand what this is all about. Reorient your recruitment, okay? To make community policing successful, basically mid-level managers who are receptive to and can implement community change strategies have to be recruited and trained. So the selection of new recruits have to be guided by a desire to find someone with the attitudes that support the community policing philosophy, right? And then reaching out to the community. And this one totally makes sense because each neighborhood has its own particular thing going on, right? Their own needs. community policing, has to be flexible and adaptive. So these are some of the challenges. It talked a little bit about foot patrol. Just to kind of let you know, there's a really cool experiment called the Newark Foot Patrol. And here, this was the first experimental evaluation on the effectiveness of foot patrol. And the results of this experiment basically suggested that foot patrol may not reduce crime, but it may reduce citizen fear of crime. Okay, so kind of an interesting thing on foot patrol. They had the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment. This was a major research collaboration between the Philadelphia Police Department and researchers in the Department of Criminal Justice, involving over 200 officers on foot beats around some of the city's most violent areas. And after 3 months, relative to the comparison areas, violent crime decreased 23%. Official records of police activities during the intervention period reveal the following in target areas. Drug-related detections increased 15%, ped stops increased 64%, vehicle stops increased 7%, and arrests increased 13%. Even with some of the crime displacement to nearby locations, analysis indicated that the foot patrols prevented 53 violent crimes during the summer. So a very successful thing. So we talked about obstacles, but how do we get over them with community policing? Well, I think, closely associated with, yet independent from community policing concept is what we call problem-oriented policing. And we're going to kind of get into that in a minute, but understand that, community policing can fit well with traditional forms of policing, meaning that you can do both. It's credited with helping reducing crime rates in large cities, and it's become a very common part of municipal police departments. When I was at Rialto, this is our Rialto Police Department Community Outreach Program, which ran our community policing program. I spoke just a second ago about problem-oriented policing. This is a style of police management that stresses proactive problem solving instead of reactive. It requires police agencies to identify these long-term community problems and develop strategies to get rid of them. It requires that police agencies rely on local residents, private persons, and learn to develop resources. It's supported by the fact that a great deal of urban crime is concentrated in a few areas called hotspots. And hotspots areas or neighborhoods are where a significant portion of this particular crime occurs. So, and when you talk about hotspots, again, relatively, places like bars, malls, bus stops, hotels, apartment buildings, where significant calls for service tend to come in. And it's used to also kind of focus in on certain types of theft. So, when you talk about combating auto theft, you might want to use technology to reduce car thefts. Reducing violence, there was something called Operation Ceasefire that was formed to reduce youth homicide and firearm violence as well. And then there's intelligence-led policing. So this is the collection and analysis of information to generate an intelligence end product designed to inform police decision-making on both the tactical and strategic level. And it relies heavily on certain things. So confidential informants, offender interviews, analysis of crime reports, suspect surveillance, community sources of information. So a lot of information, right? But these are new processes that a lot of organizations are actually using. And here, if you don't know what the intelligence process looks like, this is kind of a diagram that you can kind of go back to and review. Two types of intelligence. There'd be tactical intelligence or strategic. So tactical would be gaining or developing information related to threats of terrorism, of crime, terrorism or crime, and using this information to apprehend offenders, harden targets, meaning make it harder to commit crimes, and use strategies that will eliminate the threat. And then strategic intelligence would be information about changing the nature of certain problems and threats for the purpose of developing response strategies and maybe reallocating resources. And then finally, we'll talk about fusion centers. These were developed by the National Criminal Intelligence Sharing Plan. They support a range of law enforcement activities. They help or provide help for major incident operations and support for units charged with interdiction and criminal investigation. They provide a means for the community to run tip lines, etc. And they do really assist law enforcement executives. And basically a fusion center is kind of a intelligence sharing location, if you will. And they kind of came about after 9/11. So it's a mechanism to exchange information and intelligence. Okay, typically because of terrorism, but now law enforcement uses it for a variety of different things. So if you've never seen the inside of a fusion center, this is what it looks like, because it's basically an intel center. So again, a mechanism to exchange information, intelligence, etc. All right, and there's just a couple of police support functions within your organization. You do have other units that support that major police function, not only community policing function, but the function inside of your organization. And we're going to finish up now. We've ran a little bit over, but we're going to finish up with talking about productivity. So quickly, to improve police productivity, police administrators have sought to increase the productivity of their line support and admin staff. And as of today, this term productivity refers to the amount of order, maintenance, crime control, and other law enforcement activities provided by individual officers or unit or the department as a whole. And, to improve some of the productivity, you could consolidate certain things. You could have informal arrangements with other organizations, information sharing. Some police agencies combine resources together or they pool them together. You could contract for certain services. You might have service districts, civilian employees, special assignments, or even a differential police response. So all of these are different strategies, and you can take a little, kind of a longer look at all of those later on. Okay, so a lot to cover. We did run a little bit over, but I wanted to make sure that we got everything in, so that way we didn't leave anything out, right? So that's going to conclude our part 2 of our chapter 6 lecture on the police organization, role, and function.